When we all normally think of Christmas time, we think of happiness and joy and family time. But unfortunately for the small town of Calumet, Michigan in 1913, their Christmas was brought on with tragedy and death. In 1913, the families of coal miners gathered together at the Italian Hall, which you'll see here, and they held a Christmas party, which ended in 73 deaths, 60 of them being children. This might not be the most well-known story in history, but it's very important, and it affected this town very much, and it affects it still today. So in order to fully understand what happened that night and the effects that it has, we're going to look at three things. First, we're going to look at the coal miner strike in the town. Then we're going to look at the facts of that night at the Italian Hall. And then we're going to look at the repercussions of that night. So one of the most important things to learn is about the coal miners' strike. It was the town was full of coal miners, and they were working for 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, for 3 hours a day. And when you read El Sila's article, When Miners' Children Died in 2013, you learn about their working conditions, and you learn that they formed a union to fight these working conditions. It all started out peaceful, and there was no violence. But they did effectively close down the coal mines, which cost the owners of the coal mines a lot of money. So they decided to take matters into their own hands, and they hired strike breakers or thugs to handle it a little more violently. In broad daylight, they shot and killed 2 coal miners that were striking. This was just the beginning of the violence that would hit this small town. Now that you know a little bit more about the coal mining town and the strike that they were involved in, now we're going to learn about that fateful night at the Italian Hall. In 1913, the coal miners that were on strike that stuck around decided to forget that strike for a little bit, and they decided to have a Christmas party with their families at the Italian Hall. Everyone was having fun, the children were dancing and singing, and then someone who has not been identified ran into the building and yelled fire. That caused mass panic and chaos, and everyone ran to the only exit. That only exit was this stairwell that you see here. So all of these people ran towards these doors that were held shut. So in the chaos and the stampede, 73 people were stampeded and suffocated to death, 60 of those being children. So what started as a Christmas night, a family night, a great night, ended in death. When you read Lato in his Huffington Post article in 2011, you learn that firefighters ran to the scene to try to help. But it was so awful they couldn't even unmangle the bodies from the street. The whole town became involved in the funeral processions. It was a big deal. They all walked 3 miles through town with all of the bodies. The adults carried the children in white caskets, and the adults that died that night were carried in horse and buggies. Here is an example of the funeral procession that was held in Calumet, Michigan. So as you can see, we've learned a little bit more about what happened that night and the awful atrocities that have affected this town. So now we're going to learn a little bit more about how it's still affected today and what happened after that night. So once it was all over with, the law stepped in and they tried to figure out who it was that yelled fire. The official report was that they had no idea who it was, even though the people that were there that night determined that it was a strikebreaker. They recognized his voice and they recognized his face, but none of that was taken seriously. The president of the union was attacked, beaten, and ran out of town for trying to find out who it was. Sounds a little shady, right? So this town was left with no closure, nothing. The film producer Hawley, making the 1913 massacre film, interviewed a current resident that described how there is still the division of the residents in the town because they never got that closure, because there was issues with one half of the town thinking that it was a prank and one half of the town knowing that it was the coal mine strikebreakers that were responsible. Here we will see, in the 80s, they decided to tear down the Italian Hall. And this angered a lot of the current residents. And that just shows how powerful this event was to this town. And like I said, U.S. history might not know a lot about it, but this many years later, it affected them greatly that they tore down this building. They didn't forget, though, because they did decide to make the Memorial of Calumet, which they designed a park for, the National Park Reserves, made a park and created an archway to remember the lives of 1913 that were lost. So now that we know a little more about the coal miners' strike, the details of that night, and the repercussions that it's had on the town and still does have on the town today, I hope you can think back and realize how important this is and how important it is to our history and to remember. So as Christmas time comes around, I hope that we can all take a moment of silence and remember the lives that were lost and how this town, even to this day, will not think of Christmas the same way that we all do. Thank you.